Hello, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. I am Kwame Phillips, the Assistant Director for Programs in the Office of Multicultural Affairs. We're delighted to have everyone with us. So in the chat, um, will you share with us where you're tuning in from? Let us know where you're tuning in from and in what capacity, if you're a student, faculty, staff, or Hopkins community member. Let us know in the chat where you're tuning in from. Our speaker, our presenter, and professor for today, he is excited to come and be a visitor here at Johns Hopkins University, and we're delighted to have him as well through the virtual world. The Digital Diversity Day series started last year, spring 2020, right before COVID-19 kind of sent everyone into their virtual offices. And we wanted this to be an opportunity where we can engage the Hopkins community of faculty, staff, and most importantly, our students to become practitioners of the work as it relates to the critical race theory. So there are three objectives that we aim to meet when we're talking about the Digital Diversity Day series. And I'm gonna go over that in just a few seconds. So we have individuals from the Hopkins health system as well. We have some undergraduate students. We have students from the School of Nursing. We have people tuning in from Boston, Massachusetts, someone from UC San Diego. Thank you all for tuning in. We have graduate students present. So we have a great diverse audience for today. And I'm pretty sure you'll be able to gain something that you could really take back and add it to your tool set in whatever capacity or sphere of influence you may have. As I was mentioning about our objectives, one of the first objectives is to really educate students and higher ed professionals or practitioners on the framework of critical race theory and the implications within higher education and the overall student experience. Then secondly, our aim is to really engage students and higher education practitioners in intergroup dialogue or through the Q&A piece where we can really have conversations about race, racism, and intersectionality. And then lastly, we want to provide students and higher ed practitioners meaning faculty, staff, administrators, senior leaders, with a race-conscious approach to understanding racial inequity and its intersectional relationship to other oppressive, marginalized identities, and how you may use your sphere of influence to dismantle all forms of oppressive and inequitable systems. So we're really excited that this is the seventh session of the Digital Diversity Day series. And this is the last series of the academic year. So we're really excited. Now I would like to present our featured professor for today, Professor Gerald Torres. He will speak on the topic of who is afraid of critical race theory. Critical race theory has been the continued centerpiece. And so he's really going to connect his background into that presentation that he will give you in a few short moments. Just to give you a snapshot of who Professor Gerald Torres is, he is a professor of environmental justice at Yale School of Environment and the professor at the Yale Law School. He is the former president of the Association of American Law Schools and has taught at Stanford Law School and at Harvard Law School, where he served as Oneida Nation visiting professor of law. Professor Torres served as the counsel to the Attorney General on environmental matters in Indian Affairs at the U.S. Department of Justice. Professor Torres has served on the Board of Environmental Law Institute, the EPA National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, as well as the National Petroleum Council. He is board chair of Earth Day Network and founding chairman of the Advancement Project, the leading civil rights advocacy organization in the country. He is a trustee of the National Resources Defense Council, and he has served as a consultant to the United Nations on environmental matters, and is a life member of the American Law Institute and the Council on Foreign Affairs. So we really have an amazing speaker with a wealth of knowledge and professional experiences. And so we're really delighted to have him. So I'm going to pass this portion of the presentation and of the session to Professor Gerald Torres.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to Johns Hopkins University and the entire Hopkins community. I'm happy to be here today. I hope I can bring some insight, and I look forward to the question and answer period. I'll try to leave about 20 minutes at the end for questions. And I think Kwame will be moderating, or the staff will be moderating the questions. So I will look for questions from them. Before I begin, I'd like to make a land acknowledgement for the place I sit. Yale University acknowledges the indigenous people on whose land it is located, including the Mohegan, the Mashantucket Pequot, the Eastern Pequot, the Schaghticoke, the Golden Hill Pagusset, the Nyanek, and the Quinnipiac tribes, as well as other Algonquin-speaking people from the Connecticut region. They have stewarded the land that we now call Connecticut for millennia, and I wanted to recognize them and to continue to honor their continued presence, and for the land that we use today. That'll actually come up some later on in my talk, but I wanted to make that clear. So the reason I chose the title for the lecture today is because critical race theory has been used recently as kind of a scare cat, right? Something to frighten people. There's even a law professor who has started keeping a web-based inventory of all of the people in higher education who teach critical race theory. And he says that he uses it so that parents can advise their children to avoid taking classes from these people. The last administration prohibited the discussion of critical race theory in workshops in the agencies. They've eliminated or tried to eliminate the discussion of race-based analyses throughout the agencies. I was invited to give a talk at the Environmental Protection Agency last fall, and was then disinvited when the prohibition on critical race theory was announced. So it seemed to me, right, in the light of all of those events, it might be worthwhile just to ask whether, what's so scary about critical race theory? Is it the kind of thing that people ought not be exposed to, or that they should reject without examining? Is it catching? Right? Is it because it's something that once exposed to you, or you then suffer some kind of intellectual disability that prevents you from being a critical thinker, or is it just something that doesn't have anything to add to intellectual inquiry, and thus ought to be avoided because it's a waste of time? All of these potential claims could be true, and what I want to suggest to you today is that the uh, criticisms of critical race theory are largely ideological, and that they're ideological in that they presume that critical race theory has a specific political project that is in fact somehow not legitimate as a source of inquiry within uh, higher education or education at all. And so I want to address that question. But before I do that, I guess what I want to do is to lay out in really as simple and clear terms as I can what critical race theory is. One, how can critical race theory be used, and what kind of insights can it yield? So, critical race theory as a methodology asks you to do a couple of things. It asks you to consider the ways in which race or racial categorization has been used to define research projects, the way it's been used to define legal categories, the way it has been used to distort land use policies, the way it's been used to distort environmental policies. Uh, it basically asks you to take seriously the racial history of the West, basically, and to ask what does what does taking race seriously mean for purposes of sustained intellectual inquiry. It may be, of course, that will come to the conclusion that as to your particular discipline, it's really a matter of no consequence. At which point, that's fine. Right? It may also be that once you recognize that racial categories have been integral to the creation of um, not just academic categories of inquiry, but categories that have organized social life, then you might have to ask further questions. So let me give you just a simple example. A colleague of mine, Ed Baptiste, wrote a book called The Half That Has Never Been Told. In this book, what he outlines is the development of the internal slave trade. And he documents how the state of Virginia, having exhausted its soil in the production of tobacco, turned to the production of human capital in the form of slaves to provide slaves for the rest of the South once the external slave trade was prohibited. Well, one of the insights you get from his book is not just that this trade existed, we all knew that, and not just that there were specific parts of the country that used that aspect of the slave trade to drive their economic development. We all knew that. What he does is he looks at the kinds of financing devices that had to be created in order to finance the internal slave trade. And so what you get, and this is a point of critical race theory, what you get is an appreciation for how the financial innovation was driven by the need to finance a particular kind of human trafficking. If you hadn't paid attention to race, you might not have noticed the link between those particular financial instruments and the development of those devices and the furtherance of the enslavement of people in the United States. What you also wouldn't notice if you didn't pay attention to race is, and here I'm going to shift grounds a little bit and talk about federal Indian law. What you wouldn't have noticed were the justifications for treating Native people in the way that they were treated, especially post treaty period in our nation's history. The idea here, we can go to the tragedy of the residential schools, which is still being played out as recently as yesterday night in a decision that came out of the Fifth Circuit about the Indian Child Welfare Act. Now, you might think, well, how is the Indian Child Welfare Act connected to the residential schools? Well, it's connected to the residential schools because the residential schools were the method through which the federal government sought to break down Native cultures and thus break down tribal political and social life, and to take children from these nations away from their families. What the Indian Child Welfare Act does is, of course, recognizes that history and creates a set of jurisdictional provisions that permit tribes to intervene in cases where children are being removed from Indian families. And it's tied directly to the residential schools and the effort to dismantle tribal social life. So let's get back to the question of what does that have to do about race? Well, what it has to do about race is the Native people occupy a complex position, but one of the things that they clearly, one of the ways they were clearly viewed was through a racial lens in which they were branded as inferior and were treated as if they could be regulated in a way that other people weren't, and they could be improved by removing those aspects of Native culture from them. So here I've just given you two pretty straightforward and simple examples of what critical race theory can do. That is, by how noticing race, in fact, illuminates some of the ways in which our legal, political, and social life has evolved. Let me give you a couple of more examples. One of the things that critical race theory does is it suggests that by understanding the structural manifestations of racism, you can understand how the search for the person with the bad heart, the racist, is in fact, in many cases, the wrong search, because you have institutions that will do the work of producing a racially determinate effect without there having to be a single racist. Let me give you an example of that. Many of you recall the episode, it's now several months old, the episode in Central Park in New York, where there was a Black fellow who was birding in a place called the Bramble, in Central Park. And he came upon a woman who was walking her dog off leash. He asked her to put the dog on the leash because the dog was a hazard to birds, and it scared birds, and it was inappropriate for that part of the park. She initially refused, and so he did a trick that he says he said at the time he commonly did, which was he took a dog treat and offered it to the dog in order to be able to get the dog in a place where he could restrain it and persuade the owner to put the dog on a leash. At that moment, the woman took out her phone and called 911 and made a false claim about the fellow, the bird watcher. Now, the way this illustrates structural racism, and this is in some ways, it's almost too easy an example, was that we don't know what was in the heart of that woman making that phone call. But what we do know is that she understood that through the use of a phone call and the assertion that she was being menaced by a Black man, she could put in train an entire series of events, which, given recent history, could have resulted in his arrest, his negative encounter with the police, and in some cases, maybe even death. So it's the idea that she understood that the system would work in a way that was triggered by the racial definition, the racial identity of the person she was upset at, suggests that there is a system that uses race in ways that are totally separate from what each individual within that system may think about race or racial members, racialized members of our society. Which leads me to the next point. And that is what critical race theory does. What critical race theory does is it explores not race as if it were a thing independent in the world, but explores how the processes, in fact, race people. So the example I just gave you, right, raced her assailant. He wasn't an assailant, purported assailant, right? Raced the person she was upset at in a way that would have negative consequences. So that the process of racialization is a complex set of, and sometimes not so complex, set of social interactions that are predicated upon beliefs, even if those beliefs are outmoded. Let me give you a couple more examples, and then I will talk about Native people, and I'll talk about land, and I'll talk about environmental justice. Okay. One of the things when we talk about inequality in our societies, we commonly focus on the racialized difference in income. Although the bulk of the poor people in the United States are white, a higher percentage of people of color are poor. Why is that true? Well, one reason it seems to be true is that the mechanisms through which income is converted into wealth have been unavailable to African Americans in particular, but people of color more broadly. And I'll give you two just very simple examples of that. So when the federal government was insuring home loans after World War II, the one of the things it did was to not provide an equal access to the resources to buy homes on a racial dimension, because home and home ownership was a major and remains, I think, to this day, a major source of wealth and potential wealth generation. Lack of access to the housing market, that is the purchasing market, meant that African Americans were largely prevented from having access to at least one method of wealth creation. Friends of mine have done research on access to capital and have suggested that there's a racial dimension to the access of capital, which suggests that the capacity for African Americans to create their own businesses has been hamstrung. So that the thing that would be used to equalize participation, that is wealth in communities, has largely been distributed in a racialized way. If you weren't paying attention to race, you would not have noticed that. Let me talk about Native people for a moment. As recently as the last Supreme Court term, one of the things that you might have noted if you follow law, but even if you don't, is that the access to the land resource has been curtailed to a huge extent for Native people. So that during the period of what is called the Allotment Act period in American history, over 60% of the land that was owned and controlled by Native people was lost to them by actions that were initiated by the federal government. That, of course, has a couple of effects. One, it means that the wealth base of Native people was reduced by over 50%, by 60%, right, in a number of years. More than that, it also had an impact on the capacity of tribes to exercise the kind of jurisdiction and governmental control that would be necessary to produce the rudiments that are necessary for economic development in Indian country. So those are two, kind of just two examples of how you can have structural racism without having to identify any particular racist. So you don't have to find the person with the bad heart, the person who means to do evil. All you have to do is to have people refusing to challenge the existing operation of the institutions which have baked into them the potential for racialized outcomes. Unless you intervene in those institutions, you could eliminate every racist, that is, every person with a bad heart, and still have racialized effects. And what critical race theory does is it says, pay attention to that, because what that's going to do is it's going to tell you where you need to intervene in order to produce a more just society, a more just social system. The thing that's interesting is it doesn't just have an impact on people of color. It also has an impact on uh, other marginalized groups like poor people, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Uh, but I'll give you two examples that illustrate that point. So one of the things that's actually salient right now, and in terms of policy development, has gotten the attention of the Biden administration, and that is environmental justice. In the Justice 40 program, which the Biden administration is promoting, what he has done is to pledge that 40% of all of the benefits of environmental programs will redound to the marginalized communities that have been disadvantaged environmentally up to this point. That, of course, means that we'll have to have some metrics to figure out whether or not the benefits really are flowing in the way that the administration intends. But the upshot of that is that it will not just be communities of color that benefit by the attention to equity in environmental programs, but we'll all benefit. We'll all benefit. Let me give you an example. One of the things that COVID has revealed is that the comorbidities which make COVID more deadly are found in higher densities in poor communities and communities of color. One of the things that makes COVID more deadly is if people who have respiratory ailments are infected. So if you do a public health survey of respiratory health, what you find is that people in cities tend to have higher rates of asthma than the children in cities have a higher rate of asthma than others. The asthma is a comorbidity that's directly related to air pollution. So to the extent that that becomes a focus of enforcement and cleanup, right, the reduction of especially fine particulate matter as a constituent element of air pollution means that the air quality for everyone actually will be improved. But it's going to be improved by noticing the impact it has on these particularly vulnerable communities. To the extent that water supplies are being improved, that is, delivery system, the identification of lead pipes, which are in common use, are identified as a source of lead in the water supplies. And here you can thank the environmental justice movement for drawing attention to that issue. The infrastructure repair, which will reduce the number of lead pipes and improve the quality of public water systems, means that everyone who gets water from a public water system will benefit. The fact that there are communities of color that have been more heavily impacted by these environmental deficiencies doesn't need to find a villain. It merely needs to find the normal operation of existing institutions. So what critical race theory does, right, is it shows you how racism and racist effects can exist without racists. Okay. And that means if you don't pay attention to history and the way in which the racist aspects of our history have affected institutional development, you are going to assume that the absence of racists means that you'll have an absence of racism. Absolutely not true, right? Where the system has produced racialized effects, the failure to address those effects mean that you will reproduce the impact of what were originally racially motivated uh, uh, differences at the beginning. So, what critical race theory asks you to do is merely to pay attention, right? Pay attention to the ways in which race affects power, the way in which race has distorted our institutions, and the way in which the inscription of what I call, and my colleague Lonnie Guinier and I have called, the old racial scripts, right? The way in which those can be used to maintain current political power. Let's go back to that initial example I gave, the one about the bird watcher. What that triggered, of course, was a racial script that still has currency. I'm going to give you another example now. One of the things the United Church of Christ in their study did years ago was it identified hazardous waste sites in the United States. And it discovered that the variable that most closely correlated to the location of hazardous waste sites was race. That was in some ways viewed as one of the opening salvos in the discussion of environmental justice. So focusing just on siting and asking the question, which communities will have to be more burdened than other communities? You could look to the racial makeup of the community and be able to predict with some certainty why some communities have worse environmental outcomes than others. One of the things I discovered, though, in my research is that the communities that are often at risk for the placement of unwanted land uses or land uses that will produce negative environmental impacts are those communities that are unable to resist politically. So that the more powerful the community is, the more powerful its resistance, the greater capacity it has to ensure that the question of relative justice in the location of one environmental insult or another is taken into account. What makes community able to resist? Well, let's put aside wealth for one moment, because you could say, well, these kinds of facilities are almost never located in wealthy communities. And they're not located in wealthy communities because wealthy communities are able to mobilize political resistance more effectively earlier in the process and essentially push these facilities or these environmental insults to someplace else. So let's put aside wealth. What makes community powerful? What makes community powerful is its capacity to mobilize resistance, so that if a community can be organized to resist, it then becomes a community that can engage the political process in order to use the political process to defend itself against carrying a disproportionate burden, environmental burden in this case. So what makes a community less powerful? Well, what the research seems to show is because of the application of those old racial scripts, like the kind I was describing at the beginning of my talk, communities that are most at risk are those communities that are in the process of transition from poor white to poor black, transition from brown to black. Those communities that lack the political cohesion to access the political processes in order to use those processes to resist. So the continued application of the racial script that we're talking about is a way to prevent communities from mobilizing across race. So in fact, what critical race theory suggests is that mobilizing across race, in fact, is one of the ways in which the less powerful people in our society can attempt to overcome what is often called process failure in the political processes in order to resist. I'll give you one example, and I hope you see what it means. And then I've been talking, I don't know, 45 minutes already, I think. So I'll just talk a little bit more, and then we can have I hope a robust discussion, because I think there's actually a lot to talk about. Okay. In Texas, now about 20 years ago, maybe longer, 25 years ago, affirmative action was outlawed in higher education because of a federal court case. The federal court case was ultimately overturned by the Supreme Court, but in the interim, the state stopped taking race into account in higher education. So what the Texas legislators did was they said, look, access to the flagship schools in Texas ought to be broadly available to any student who can make use of a university level education. The state of Texas also had an obligation to equalize spending in public schools so that the quality of the education you got was not dependent upon the income of your parents. Okay. So you have those two drivers. What some researchers discovered was that historically, 10% of the high schools in Texas had filled over 75% of the freshman seats at Texas A&M and the University of Texas at Austin. And you had legislators from largely from South Texas, led by Representative Rangel, and you had representatives from Houston, who said, this isn't fair. This isn't fair. That it's a public resource and it ought to be made broadly available. So they created a plan, which has come to be called the Texas 10% plan. And what they said is, if you graduate in the top 10% from an accredited Texas high school, you are automatically eligible to enroll at the University of Texas or Texas A&M, the flagship schools. They then made another discovery. The other discovery that they made is that the distribution of seats that I discussed, right? That 10% of the high schools in Texas had filled 75%, over 75% of the seats in A&M and UT Austin. What they discovered was that there were some all white rural counties in West Texas that had never sent a student to the University of Texas. So it wasn't just burdening Mexican American students from South Texas or African American students from East Dallas or Houston. It was burdening essentially poor, rural white kids. And in fact, it was the legislators from those counties, those West Texas counties, who linked arms with the legislators in from South Texas and Houston, and said, we think that our constituents have been paying taxes to support these universities all these years, and the students ought to have the same chance to go to the university as the students who are in those elite high schools. But it's not fair, people said, because somebody who goes to X high school, somebody who graduates at the bottom of X high school, is going to be a better student than somebody who graduates valedictorian of Y high school. And that student shouldn't be punished. And what the legislators from West Texas said was, we, the legislators, are under an obligation to ensure that every student who goes to a Texas, accredited Texas public school has an equal chance to get the same quality education. And so it's too late in the day to punish students from underfunded public schools because we haven't done our job. And in fact, what you had then, right, it took race, noticing race, to uncover the disparity in the distribution of the resource called higher education in Texas. If you hadn't noticed race, you never would have noticed the disparity in the allocation of that resource. What you also wouldn't have done is you wouldn't have created the possibility for cross-racial political alliances to be constructed in order to reform higher education in Texas. Now, the interesting thing about the 10% plan, it's now 25 years old, is you now have thousands of students who've gone to the University of Texas and have graduated from the University of Texas who, under conventional enrollment systems, might never have gone. But the other thing is, if you look at the data, and it's available from the University of Texas website, if you look at the data, the students who have excelled measured by GPA and graduation within 4 years, the students who have excelled are those students who've been admitted to UT and Texas A&M through the 10% plan. So what it meant was that by noticing race, you first of all noticed the disparity in the distribution of this good, but you also then, it caused you to bring your attention to those qualities that the students bring to their education that you might not have picked up if you just relied on the old system of admissions. So you can't measure things like grit. You can't measure things like desire. And what these students who matriculated at Texas under the 10% plan brought were those kinds of attributes, virtues, that would have otherwise gone undetected. Now that process that I've just described is a function of what I would call a critical race theoretical approach to understanding education in Texas. So I've now given you environmental, I've given you wealth. I've given you education. I've given you public safety examples, all of which were made visible by using the methodology of critical race theory. What critical race theory does then is it expands our capacity to know things. And what we're supposed to be doing in the academy is trying to expand and add things to the store of human knowledge. Pretty plain and simple. That's what we're supposed to be doing. If we have a methodology that permits us to do that, then we ought to do it. It doesn't necessarily say what we're going to do with that knowledge, right? That's the decision for policymakers and politicians and people outside of the academy. But it can produce an additional way of understanding the society we live in that is more profound, more complete, and which takes into account the history current social relations stand on. Okay, I'll finish up with one thing that well, maybe I'll stop here. I was going to talk about decolonization because it is currently being used in a lot of academic discussion. And I'll be happy to answer some questions about that if you have questions about decolonization. But what I've tried to do is just suggest to you that there is nothing to be afraid of when you confront critical race theory. I'm not trying to brainwash you. No critical race theorist is trying to brainwash you. All we're saying is that if you look more broadly and more deeply, you'll see more. And if you see more, you should report on what you see. You should try to analyze what you see. You should try to use it to criticize the received wisdom. Because it's through the criticism of the received wisdom that we actually produce or continue to produce knowledge. Our sole obligation is to try to produce knowledge. If we can do that, then we ought to. And we shouldn't limit our capacity to do that merely because there is a political fear about what it might reveal. It might reveal many things. What the political dimensions of its revelations are is not yet completely known. I think we ought to look. The other thing we ought to do is we ought to look at the methodology of critical race theory and ask, what are the virtues of that methodology and how might it be applied more broadly to broaden our inquiry of social relations, history, more generally, and then to ask, what does that tell us about how we ought to advise people who are actually making policy, who are actually doing the work in the world. So I'll stop there and answer any questions you might have. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. I hope I was clear, and I hope you make your own inquiries into critical race theory and make your own judgments about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Torres, for this wonderful presentation and insight that you provided for today. There is a question within the chat, and I'll read it. Bruce stated, wonderful presentation. He wanted to see if you can provide an analogy of critical race theory without taking into account the Western religious philosophy, preaching or practice of domain-oriented thinking of us over all else, including other races, and primarily among white Christian followers in the country, or in this country.
I'm not exactly sure how to approach that problem. I mean, one of the things you could do, of course, right, and is to ask if you understand the history of race, and you understand the uses to which religion was put in order to reinforce those racial categories, it then leads you to ask more questions about the political uses of religion, and that I mean, if you look at some of my heroes, let's be frank, John Muir, right? John Muir is one of those people who helped founded the Sierra Club, and is an icon in the conservation world. Or Aldo Leopold, for example, Teddy Roosevelt, right, created the first national parks. You look at all of those, but then you have to look at how did they consider, value, think of the people who were already there, right? So you have the idea, say, of wilderness. So John Muir is on record for thinking the Indians ought to be removed. Thinking that they were an impediment to the protection of the lands in the West. But remember, wilderness is a distinctly American idea. Okay, and so when the national parks were created, right, one of the things that had to be done in order to satisfy the ideal of wilderness, is the people who were there had to be removed. So Native people were removed wholesale from those places that were designated national parks. That's largely forgotten. But if you look at Bill Cronin's book, Changes in the Land, what you also realize is that the quote wilderness that the initial European colonists confronted wasn't in fact wild land, right? It was in fact a landscape that had been managed by the people who lived here. And it's a failure to understand that which contributes to a vision, or a confused vision, in my opinion, of what we ought to value in terms of conservation. So, putting aside, now some of that was, of course, religiously based, right? But I think what the climate crisis will do for us is it will help us reflect on what we have to do to preserve the world so that it remains a home for all of us, because the world is going to be here whether it's humans or not, right? And what climate change does is it says, if you want the world to remain a hospitable home for humans, then you've got to act in particular ways, right? I don't think there's a religious answer to climate change. That is, I mean, I don't think you can turn to the scriptures as to find a prescription. You may turn to them and find a reason not to do something, but then that ought to be debated on the grounds of theology. I would ask people who want to go down that route to turn to my colleague Mary Evelyn Tucker, whose work is almost completely rooted in scripture and spiritual connections for justifying conservation and environmental protection. And her whole life work is on that, and she's probably she'd be the leading expert to discuss that with. Okay, so that's, I don't know if that was a good answer to that question or not, but. If there are additional questions, I'll be happy to answer it.
Yes, we have another question um, from Sakina, I believe. Can further explain the political process as it pertains to race and community? What is the actual process, and how can one determine when the process has failed?
Yeah, one of the phrases I used in my talk was process failure. Okay, and what I mean by that is, and here, I can't mask any commitment to values, because my view is that to the extent that we live in a political system that is based on consent, then what we have to do is to ensure that the processes generate the widest amount of participation in order to act legitimately as an expression of popular consent. So if you look at how poor people and people of color have been excluded from the political process, you can say that if there are systematic ways in which people have been excluded, there's been a political process failure, and that whatever decision results from a flawed process is itself going to be flawed. Let me give you an example. In the Kettleman City case in California, there was an industrial facility that was going to be located in a rural, poor community that was populated predominantly by immigrants and recent immigrants, Mexican Americans. Many of the people who live in that community were monolingual Spanish speakers. When the process began it began to make the determination of whether the facility should be located there, all of the material that was produced for the public to review was either done in a scientific idiom that would be beyond the ken of the average person, and it was all done in a language that the community couldn't read. The argument of the lawyers in that case was that the scientific documents have to be made accessible. That is, you can't have something that is unintelligible and pretend as though you've communicated. You have to have an intelligible description of the process and the risks in order for the people who are going to be making a judgment about the project to be able to make a fair assessment. That's one. Two, you have to communicate in a language that the people who are going to be subjected to the project understand, which in some ways you can view it as a subset of the first. That is, it has to be intelligible to the people you're asking to make a judgment about it. If it's not intelligible, then there has been a process failure. what we see going on nationally right now is an attempt to limit the franchise, which in my view renders any decision that is issued by a process that knowingly excludes people who have a stake in the decision is an invalid process. That's what I mean by process failure. I don't know if that answered the question, but I hope it did.
Thank you, Dr. Torres. The next question is, can you further explain the political process as it pertains to race and community? And what is the actual process, and how can one determine when the process has failed?
Okay, that's a version of the one I just answered, I think. But
no, yeah, that was the one we
sorry,
just
sorry.
asked.
Right.
But
Sorry.
I do have the next one. It says, thank you for the insightful talk from Kelly. I would be interested in hearing about your thoughts on decolonization and what that looks like or will continue to look like within academia and policymaking.
Well, there's a wonderful article by two writers, Tuck and Wang, that's entitled "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor." Okay, because you see a lot of loose talk about decolonization, and what they argue is that it could what. So Tuck and Yang, decolonization is not a metaphor. We'll put that to one side for a second. There's another book by an anthropologist named Linda Smith, who has written a book called Decolonizing Methodology. And what both of them argue is that two things. Is the inquiry you are making merely a form of knowledge extraction, such that you are going to extract things from a community without benefiting the community? If it is, that is in effect a colonial process. Okay, one. So that's just a straight kind of methodological question. Second, and because Dr. Smith was an anthropologist, she wrote mainly to other anthropologists. But what she said is, when you are going to be working with a community, that community has to benefit from the fruits of your labor as much as you. That is, you have to work with them and permit their insight to guide your inquiry. The other thing is that what decolonization means. I mean, if we really took it seriously, everybody would run away screaming, right? Because what it would mean is let's give the land back. I don't think that's going to happen. So what you have to ask is, if you're taking decolonization as a commitment, then what you have to do is to ask, how has, just like we were asking questions about racism before, how have the processes of colonization affected the politics you are currently adopting and the research questions that you're asking? And that's like the most minor first step, right? But the other things you've got to do, like for instance, in my work with Native people, right, actively working to help them reclaim the resources that they have been deprived of is a form of decolonization. And that can be done consistent with the um, objective production of knowledge, right? So that trying to identify Aboriginal lands um, and asking questions about who ought to have uh, an influence. Let's go back to the question about process that was asked just before. Who ought to have influence in making decisions about the uses of those Aboriginal lands? Right, would be a form of decolonizing inquiry, decolonizing process. For lawyers, and I apologize because I know this isn't a legal audience, but for lawyers, what it would mean is taking the trust obligation that the federal government has to Native people in the United States seriously, and asking at every moment, what does the faithful exercise of that trust duty mean? Let me talk about a case that was decided last term in the Supreme Court. Uh, there was a case, and it was a pretty horrible case. The fellow was committed a horrible crime and was arrested by Oklahoma authorities and sentenced to prison. And then he sought relief in federal courts, arguing that Oklahoma didn't have jurisdiction over him because he was really arrested in Muskogee Creek territory. And so the question the Supreme Court had to decide is whether the territory that the fellow was arrested in had somehow been transferred to Oklahoma, or whether it remained within the boundaries of the Muskogee Creek Reservation. Ultimately, the court held that that despite the sale of the land to non-Indians and the ownership of the land by people who were far into the Muskogee Creek Nation, that the external boundaries of the reservation had not been diminished. And so the place where the arrest occurred was in Indian country, and thus the prosecution should have been done either in the Indian courts, the tribal courts, or by the federal government. I mean, that to me is it's done within a colonial process, but it recognizes that there are some limits to the continued expression of colonialism in the relationship between the Native people here, the Muskogee Creek, and the state within which they're located. I mean, the most horrible thing that they could say, that the proponents of the state could say, was that parts of the city of Tulsa will be included within the Muskogee Creek territory. And how horrible would it be to go to sleep in Oklahoma and wake up in Muskogee Creek territory? Right? That was considered to be a terrible thing. And my response to that was, I bet they won't feel a bit different. I'll bet they'll wake up just like they always do. And what they will recognize is that their life is unchanged. It's just that they are subject to us. This is a complicated question. I don't want to get into it too much. They are now within Indian country. That will affect some things, but by and large, their life will be unchanged. Right? And it's nothing that the state of Oklahoma and the Muskogee Creek Nation couldn't negotiate. Right? And what it does is it changes the basis upon which negotiation has to occur. So if you take decolonization seriously, what it means is looking at the impact of colonization, both in terms of material reality, that is, what has it actually produced, and second, in terms of how it has affected your analytic methodology, that you're going to be applying to answer any particular question. And so it requires a bit of self-reflection, recognizing that decolonization is part of the calculus of justice.
We do have a couple of more questions in the Q&A feature. For those of us not really directly involved in law, for example, those who may be going into healthcare or other disciplines, how can we incorporate CRT into our career and lives?
One of the great things about public health, for example, is it gives you a way to analyze the community impacts of threats to health, right? So one group that I'm involved with in Los Angeles is looking at street level violence and gang violence and police violence. And what they're doing is they're saying, look, we need to take the insights of public health and to treat the violence in this community as a public health issue. And that means we've got to analyze the entire community and work back from an analysis of the entire community in order to change the things that will ultimately reduce the impact of this particular harm. So that the public health, I mean, I'm glad you raised that question, because you don't have to be a lawyer, right, to critical race theory, to do critical race theory. You can apply it to any discipline. So that the advancement project, one of the things the advancement project did in LA was it used GIS technology to map where public health dollars were being spent in Los Angeles County, down to the neighborhood level. It also took into account things like money spent on bus shelters, where bus routes go, the relationship between the location of hospitals and gun violence. Right, so you can use those kind of mapping tools, which are insight. The critical race theory drove the questions, but to use other disciplines to lead you to ask how you can ameliorate the harms or mitigate the harms, right, to a certain extent. So, I mean, it was crazy, right? If you have the map of LA and you have a map that locates gun violence, and you overlay that with a map of where hospitals are located, right? And you realize that what you're going to have to do is change the access to medical care, even as you reduce gun violence, right? Both things, right? That's the kind of thing that you don't need to be a lawyer to do that. You know, the idea that you're going to have bus shelters as part of the public health budget makes sense, because standing in the elements while you wait for the bus, right, is a potential public health issue. Now in LA it doesn't get cold, but there are places around the country where it does, right? And the capacity to get out of the cold while you're waiting for the bus is a critical thing. Where do buses go, right? One of the things we discovered is that you couldn't take a bus to a hospital. Well, if you rely on public transportation, then you are at a severe health outcome deficit, right? If you have to use public transit, and you have to get to places where medical assistance is available. You don't need to be a lawyer to analyze any of that. You just have to look at the data that's available and ask the questions that critical race theory asks you to ask about what that data tells you. And so I guess that'd be one answer. But public health is a huge place where critical race theory actually has been used a lot.
Thank you. We have another question on the Q&A section, and that is, could you comment on the national demonstrations of Stop Asian Hate and Black Lives Matters?
Uh, um, I want to say two things. They'll both be provocative, probably. I don't know. Maybe they won't. The anti-Asian hate, right? I'm going to bracket that for one moment. But what it tells you, what it should tell all of us, is we ought to check our nativism, right? Nativism, which we saw its most ugly expression with the treatment of immigrants at the border, in fact, has expression throughout our culture. And the anti-Asian animus that we've seen, right, is an expression of nativism. And so, whether you're a member of the Black community, whether you're a member of the Latinx community, you've got to ask yourself, to what extent does nativism drive your own views about other people? That's one. Second, the anti-Asian violence is racist to this extent. It's racist in general, right? But it's also racist because it lumps together people who are ethnically diverse, right, as having something in common, and what they have in common is they're not like us, right? And it's a way to put anxiety and anger about the pandemic, or to use the pandemic as a decoy to hide behind the kind of non-racial, non-Asian animus that you find. Remember, right, one of the, put aside Jim Crow and that whole analysis for a minute. Until what? Was it 2 years ago? When it was finally declared unconstitutional? It was constitutional to lock up Asian people, right? In World War II, we interned Japanese Americans, citizens. And the Supreme Court at that point held that that was not unconstitutional. It's only recently that it's become unconstitutional. So, there has to be unity to oppose anti-Asian violence across the board, period, full stop. Right? And what BLM has done is it's brought the focus back to the way in which systemic racism works regardless of whether there's a racist, right? So what people forget, right, is Black Lives Matter also brought attention to the impact of lead in the water in Flint, right? So they've done environmental justice work, they're doing police reform work, and they're bringing our attention to things that ought to trouble all of us. And so the other thing I want to say is, and I realize we're at the time, and so I won't talk at length. It is, don't buy the false narrative that the BLM protests were violent. 95% of them were non-violent. Right? It's when the violence shibboleth is used, right? It's used to try to discredit something that is a legitimate complaint, right? And so you need to look at the stories that are told about BLM, and you need to interrogate them. And this is where critical race theory actually comes in handy, because it allows you to interrogate the stories that are told, and to ask, what is the narrative structure of that story? What are the morals that we're supposed to take from that story? And why is that story wrong? anyway, so thank you. I mean, I realize it's 3:30 and I've probably taken more time than you want. But I want to thank you for having me. I want to thank those in the audience for listening, for asking good questions. I've enjoyed it. I think one of the, there's a lot of downsides to remote learning. One of the upsides is I can come visit you remotely and speak to you. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for taking the time to visit us today as well. And thank you to all of our audience that are also here from all over the place and not necessarily just Baltimore or Maryland. So this is one of the opportunities the pandemic has provided us, is that the ability to join from at home, right? So thank you all for being here tonight. And this conversation is an ongoing conversation, and we all know that. And as a Office of Multicultural Affairs, we would like to continue these conversations with you and with our audience. And in doing so, we have our upcoming events that I've already listed in our chat box. We do have an identity series and cuisine night celebrating Indigenous heritage next week on Tuesday. The RSVP link is also on the chat box as well. And if you visit OMA website, you'll be able to see that we have a few upcoming events still left for our remainder of our semester. Feel free to join us. And you're also welcome to join us, Dr. Torres, for the Identity Series and Cuisine Night, of course, but also for our upcoming events. Some of our major events that are coming up is also celebrating Apita heritage, Asian Pacific Desi Islander heritage. And so we have Angeline Chen joining us next Thursday at 6 p.m. And you're also invited and welcome to attend as well. If you all have any questions, or you would like to participate or engage with OMA, feel free to email me or Kwame. I dropped my email address as well on the chat box. So if you have any questions or any ideas, you want to collaborate with us, our audience are invited to do so. And we are always looking for new opportunities and evolving opportunities to connect with everyone. So thank you all for being here tonight. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. And with that, thank you again for your wonderful talk today.
Thank you.
So applaud.